Our speaker today is very special. His name is Jeff LaHurd. Alex St. Paul is going to introduce Mr. LaHurd in a moment, but I'm going to take you back several years before she does that. In the winter of 1904, the lawyers in Manatee County created the Manatee County Bar Association. The very few lawyers who were practicing here were in Bradentown. I don't know, maybe they called it Bradenton, but it was spelled Bradentown, Palmetto, what was the town of Manatee. I never knew there was a town of Manatee. There was at that time. And of course, Sarasota. Those lawyers would show up and appear in court at a wooden two-story courthouse located on Manatee Avenue that was built in 1894. You might recognize some of the names, perhaps not. John Singletary, O.K. Reeves, James Stewart, C.T. Curry. These were some of the original members of our Bar Association. Over a century ago, those lawyers looked for a member in the region who could lead this very tiny Bar Association. On February 7, 1905, the members of the bar elected the famous and charismatic Colonel John Hamilton Gillespie, is the individual you're going to hear so much about today from Mr. LaHurd, to be their president. I'm really looking forward to today's program and speaker, because our speaker today is the authority on John Gillespie, the first president of the Manatee County Bar Association. Mr. Gillespie is not just famous for being the first bar president, but for so many accomplishments in addition to being the first leader of our Bar Association. Each one of you here today is going to be fascinated by the story of this man we are lucky to claim as one of our own. And Alex St. Paul is going to introduce today's speaker. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks. Local author and historian Jeff LaHurd has spent most of his life in Sarasota. He came as a little boy, and he lived in Sarasota all his life. He's written 17 books, mostly about Sarasota history. He's traveled the world, and I learned today that he's going back to Paris, where he has been 15 times. I'm really envious. I'd like to be doing that too. Anyway, he attended St. Martha's School, Cardinal Mooney High School, and graduated from Sarasota High School in 1964. He attended college at Manatee Junior College and the University of South Florida, where he received a BA in history and an MA in counseling. He recently retired from Sarasota County as a history specialist. His hobbies include Grand Prix racing and praying annually for the Cleveland Browns to produce a winning team. His prayers are seldom answered. He loves to travel. Besides Paris, he's traveled all over the world. He owns a blue 1974 Triumph, and he says it starts practically every time, but just in case, he's got a AAA membership. So I'd like to introduce you to Jeff LaHurd. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. My parents moved to Sarasota in 1950, and Sarasota of 1950 was every bit like it was in 1925. In fact, from about 1925 to about 1965, if you came to Sarasota one time, came back 40 years later, it was basically the same place. And the reason for that was Sarasota and Bradenton came together during the mid-20s land boom. A.B. Edwards, who was the first mayor of the city, said that it would normally have taken between 50 and 100 years for that same amount of infrastructure to be put in place. Well, the land crash was followed by the Great Depression, so nothing happened then, and that was followed by World War II, so nothing happened until after World War II, and things didn't crank up again until the post-World War II boom. What I'm going to talk to you about today, we're going to talk about John Hamilton Gillespie, and I think we're going to make it through until the 1920s when Sarasota and Bradenton came and became a universal destination for snowbirds. Now, this is the Platte of Sarasota that was platted in 1885. And you can't read the streets from here, but they're named after fruits like strawberry, lime, lemon, orange, kumquat. And the reason for that was the Florida Mortgage and Investment Company was selling these Scots on the idea that they could come over here and easily become gentlemen farmers. Now, this is Lewis Colson and his wife Irene Colson, and they were among the first black couple to come to Sarasota. He had come with the engineering company to plat the community, and he was the one that held the stake in the center of 5 Points when they platted Sarasota, and he stayed on to become a very important African-American leader here. Now, this is Moffat, Scotland. And these are the types of villages and hamlets the Scott colony came from. There were probably about 60-some strong. And they sold all of their goods, all of their possessions, bid family and friend farewell, and took a ship over. Now, this is Gillespie's residence. This is Huntley Hall. And you can look it up in Google today, and it looks exactly the same as it does back then. This is what they arrived to find. They didn't find a little Scotland. They were the first people to be screwed in Sarasota real estate, but certainly not the last. And this gentleman is Anton Kleinoshag. And if you look closely at his face, you can see it was really rough days back in the pioneer days. Everything we take for granted today, they did not have. And he described his life here as basically miserable. He said that mosquitoes were enough to drive one mad. And he gave an account of mosquitoes killing 2 of his dogs. And it wasn't unusual for swarms of mosquitoes to get around the faces of livestock and suffocate them. Now, this is our hero. This is John Hamilton Gillespie. And he's considered the father of Sarasota. The company failed miserably. After about 3 months, most everybody had left. But the Florida Mortgage and Investment Company still had 50,000 acres to sell. So they sent John Hamilton Gillespie over to put into place the infrastructure that should have been here when the colony arrived. And that stick he's holding, that's not a cane, that's a golf club. They called them Sunday sticks in those days because golf was frowned on in Scotland on Sunday. So gentlemen had these things that could be mistaken for a cane, and when nobody was looking, they could flip it over and take a few practice shots. Does anybody know why a round of golf has 18 holes? Because there's 18 shots in a bottle of scotch. That's true. So Gillespie's course only had 9 holes, so that meant he drank twice as much as everybody else, I guess. Now, this is his first home, and it was built on Palm Avenue, near where the Orange Blossom condominiums are, over there by Carajulio's. And it was her first home constructed in Sarasota based on architectural plans. And this is the hotel that he built. This opened up in 1887. And to give you your bearings, you're looking up from about Marina Jacks to 5 Points. And the hotel would be where the Orange Blossom condominiums are today. And this is the first golf club in Sarasota. This was completed in 1905. And his first course was a 9-hole affair, and it went from Lynx Avenue in downtown Sarasota east to Tuttle Avenue, then a dogleg back, and the 9th hole was in front of his home. And this is some ladies. That's him in the center there with his hands in his pockets. And this is he with his manservant, Leonard Reed, who helped him lay out the first course. Now, transportation was really difficult during these times. The only way to get from Sarasota to Bradenton and Tampa easily was from a steamship, and this is Vandalia. So when Hamilton Gillespie came to town, one of the things he decided was, if we have transportation, it'll help Sarasota flourish. So he built a train spur to go from Bradenton to Sarasota, and it was known as the Slow and Wobbly because it was slow and it was wobbly. And the only time it took passengers anywhere is when the conductor felt there were enough paying customers to make the trip worthwhile. And this is when World War I started, Gillespie went back to Scotland hoping to get an assignment in the war. He wanted to go to the front lines, but he was much too old. So they put him in charge of training some young recruits, and that's he in the center there. And this is marching up. This is right after the war, and you can see him on the left-hand side in his uniform marching up Lower Main Street. This is Byrd Key. And Byrd Key has a very interesting history. In about 1909 or 1910, a lady named Davy Lindsay Wooster came to the area for her health. And she took a launch out to Lido and Byrd Key, and she just fell in love with the place. And her husband, Thomas, lived in Cincinnati, and she wrote him this beautiful description of the area. And she ended it by saying, "This is what I want for my old age. Words cannot paint the scene. Imagination cannot conceive of such grandeur." So Thomas bought the island from the state, and they built what became known as New Edsall Castle, or the Wooster Mansion. This is it. It's where the Byrd Key Yacht Club is today. And after they died, the mansion ultimately came to John Ringling. And his plan was for it to be the winter White House of Warren G. Harding. And that's why the streets around St. Armand's are named after the presidents. Warren Harding died before the plan could be taken in effect. And so Ringling's sister lived there until she passed away. Now this is Byrd Key when it was joined to the mainland by Ringling. Now this is Sarasota's first newspaper. They arrived in 1899 when there were probably only about 200 people here. They came from Manatee and saw the potential in Sarasota. And I've read through all of the old newspapers, all the Sarasota Times, and one of the things that really struck me was how different their obituaries were. You know, they were really subjective because everybody in the community knew everybody else, and when one person passed away, it was heartfelt. You knew who he was, who his family was. And I copied a couple of them down to give you an idea. This is Captain Frank Guptill, who died in 1912. "Death cast a gloom over Osprey. If Mr. Guptill had an enemy, it will be hard to find him." And this is Alfred P. Jones, 1912. "Mr. Jones was a good and kind neighbor, was strictly temperate in his habits, using neither liquor or tobacco. He made little outward appearance of his Christianity, but he was a Christian at heart," which I took to mean he didn't smoke or drink, but what the heck, he didn't go to church either. And this is my favorite. I won't use the name. "He has been drunk for a week and dies in that condition." Now this to me is a very iconic photograph of downtown Sarasota, and it's significant to me for two reasons. One, you can see Sarasota's first roundabout in the center of 5 Points there. And the other significance is it's the last time you could find a place to park in downtown Sarasota. Now this is the first legitimate train service. The Slow and Wobbly didn't last very long. But in 1902, Seaboard announced that they were coming, and John Hamilton Gillespie and about 56 others met down at that pier that we saw and voted to incorporate as a town. And then 1903, the railroad finally came. This is, again, there's a roundabout in 5 Points, a little different one here. But these are the boys that were off in World War I, and they came home and they had a parade for them. And that flagpole was put there, and the Stars and Stripes was donated by Bertha Palmer. And the reason I have this slide, you see in the center of the street that says "Welcome Buddies," and that's the sentiment that's on today's roundabout. If you go down Sarasota and you look at that, that's where they got that "Welcome Buddies" on the sign today. Now, fire was an ever-present threat, you know, both Bradenton and Sarasota, and this is a fire raging out of control lower Main Street. So they built this is about 1912 or 1913, and you see the building on the right, that was the Tonnelier building, and that was Sarasota's first all fireproof building. And they had the fireproof Palms Theater in there. Dr. Helton had an office, and it was a hotel. And about 6 months after this picture was taken, this is what it looked like. It turned out that the only thing that was fireproof was the fireplace itself that you can see on the right-hand side. Now, this is a very insignificant ad on the face of it, but this played a very significant role in the Manatee County's development. This was an ad taken out by J.H. LaHurd, who was a big landowner in the area. And it's advertising Florida. This was taken out in the Chicago Sunday Tribune, and it caught the eye of Bertha Palmer in 1910. So she and her entourage came down for a look-see. This is Bertha. And she just fell in love with the area. And she declared that Sarasota Bay was more beautiful than the Bay of Naples, and it generated a lot of interest internationally. And it also set up a Chicago connection to Sarasota. She came, Owen Burns came from Chicago, Andrew McCanch came from Chicago, Marshall, the Fields came, so there was a big Chicago connection. And there's kind of a funny story about Bertha. She was always regaled in jewels, and you know, she was known around the world. And her husband gave her the Palmer House as a wedding present. And she had always had beautiful pearls and tiaras and everything. And her husband, Potter, was about 25 years older than she was. So Potter was talking to his attorney one day, going over his will. And his attorney said to him, "You know, Potter, Bertha is quite a few years younger than you are, and undoubtedly she's going to remarry someone, and he's going to end up with your money." And Potter said, "Well, he's going to need it." Now, this is another building that John Hamilton Gillespie erected. This was a combination sanitarium and hotel. If you went to the check-in desk and asked for a straitjacket, they'd put you in the sanitarium. Otherwise, you'd get a Bayview room. And this is another one of his buildings. This was on the corner of Pineapple and Main Street, where the Zenith building is today. Now, this is Sarasota County's breakaway from Manatee County. And the reason that they wanted to break away and go their own way was they said too much tax dollars were going up to Manatee and too little of it was coming back down. One year they said that 350,000 went to Manatee and only 35,000 came back down in improvements. And they were particularly perturbed about the road situation. One of the Sarasota city councilmen said that he had 2 flat tires on his way to Bradenton one day. Now the lovely lady on the left is Emma Booker. And she's the lady for whom Booker schools are named after. And she was a local educator in Sarasota. And when this picture was taken, it was felt that a black person didn't need any more than an 8th grade education. So she financed a lot of the black children who wanted to further their education in Tampa or Fort Myers. Now, this is the parade after Sarasota was declared a county. This is the parade. And again, you're looking down Lower Main Street. And the building in the background, that's the old Hoover Arcade, the old City Hall building. Now, this gentleman, this is Andrew McCanch, and he also came from Chicago. And he plays a significant role because Sarasota, as the 20s got underway, had everything it needed to be a desirable destination for snowbirds. It had the weather, it had the beaches, it had the intrinsic beauty, but what it lacked was world-class accommodations. So McCanch came to town and he got with the city council and he said, if you give me free electricity, free water, and no taxes for 10 years, I'll build you a world-class hotel. So they agreed to that, and he built first these apartments on Palm Avenue. This is where Cargiulio's is. Do you know Cargiulio's restaurant there? Does anybody know Cargiulio's restaurant? Oh, good. Because I've got to deal with Paul Cargiulio. If I mention his restaurant 3 times, he gives me a free pizza. Just takeout. So these went up in 60 days. This was known as the 60-day wonder. And behind them, he built the world-class hotel. This is the Miramar. And it was a very luxurious hotel. And it stayed there until the 70s. Ultimately, it was turned into retirement apartments, and then it was demolished in favor of the world's ugliest parking deck. Now, as the 20s were heating up, the speed was the name of the game. You know, they had real estate agents all over the community, both here, Bradenton, everywhere. You know, they'd sleep on benches, they'd sleep in their cars, they'd sleep at the train depots. And when you got off of the train, there'd be somebody there to grab you by the arm and try to take you to his office, sell you a binder on a piece of property. So this is asking, how does your brain work? And they assure if your brain doesn't work quickly, you are going to lose out in Sarasota real estate. Now, this is a group of Sarasota real estate. It's kind of the uniform of the day. You know, the knicker pants and two-tone socks and jet combs back hair for the men and ties. Now, do you see that lady in the middle there? Can you make her out? That's Michael Saunders' mother. No, not really. I was just kidding you. But Michael Saunders and I go way back. I started in the juvenile court in 1970 as a counselor, and she worked in the juvenile court, aid for dependent children. So we got to know each other pretty well. In about 1971 or so, we were in I think Judge Dean's office or whatever, and she was saying, what do you think about me going into Sarasota real estate? And I looked at her and I said, Michael, you're going to give up a $6,500 a year job to go into real estate? You got to be crazy. Now, this is how Sarasota saw itself in the mid-20s. City of glorified opportunity. Golfing, swimming, boating, fishing, shooting, baseball, tennis, etc. You know why they use etc., don't you? Because they don't have anything else to say, but they didn't want to leave it at that. And then they assure everybody we're here 365 days in the year. Now, this is J.H. Floyd. And he was another black civic leader. He came to Sarasota about 1925 or 1926 and got into the construction industry and did quite well for himself. I mean, you have to remember these days, Sarasota, Florida was segregated. You know, I went to the school into the 60s, went to MCC. I never went to class with a black person. You know, I never saw a black person in church. I assume there were no black Catholics. So they didn't really integrate until civil rights legislation in 1965 or so. Now, this is the Edwards Theater, and this opened in 1926. This is where today's Sarasota Opera House is. And this is some of the stuff they used to show in the Roaring '20s. dangerous curves. You'll hear Clara's lines as well as see them. You know, Clara was the it girl. Now, this is Sarasota's first brick high school. And this was on Upper Main Street, just east of Orange Avenue, where the coffee carousel is today. And these are some of the students. This is from the class of 23. And I jotted down the curriculum that year. It really blew my mind what they had to take. History of American literature, the classics, U.S. history, plane trigonometry, Virgil, chemistry, civil government of Florida, and French grammar. Can you imagine that? I think we've dumbed down a lot since those days. You know, I jotted down my own curriculum. I went to St. Martha's for 9 years. It was an 8-year program, but I had to stay an extra year. Then I went to Cardinal Mooney. That was a 4-year program, but they asked me to leave after 3. So I finally ended up at Sarasota High School, where I finally graduated. And this was what my curriculum was: arithmetic, remedial English, remedial biology, Spanish for idiots, woodworking, Latin 1, and Latin 1. I took Latin for 3 years. The only thing I remembered is, ¿Dónde es la biblioteca? And we were in Mexico, and I wish I would have learned to say, ¿Dónde es la bathroom? It would have done me a lot better, more good. Now, this is where I did finally graduate from. This is Sarasota High School, which opened in 1927. And this is the new edition, the Rudolph edition, that was opened in the mid to late 1950s, and he was a world-renowned architect, one of the chief lights in the Sarasota School of Architecture. And this is my class actually going back and forth. We used to have to go between the old school and the new school. You know, you see everybody kind of tied up and everything. And this is today's class. And these are the teachers. This is something about a union contract or something. Now, when I was in high school, the place that everybody wanted to go to was a trail drive-in. Do y'all remember the trail drive-in? Yeah. This was the groping capital of Sarasota. My father had a 1958 Buick Super 88, and it had a trunk in it the size of a small apartment. And you could put 4 or 5 kids in it, which is what we did. So everybody would chip in a quarter, and they'd get in the trunk, and I'd drive through, and the car's going at a list like that. But we finally got in, and but I often, you know, everybody used to want to go there and sit in the back row, you know, whatever. And I often thought that I never had much success there because my girlfriend, by the time she got out of the trunk, she was PO'd. And this is some of the stuff they used to show. I had a... You ruined me, Eddie. I love it. The Touch of Flesh, and later Chatterley's Lover. A whole town exploded when a boy and a girl dared go beyond the blue denim stage. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff we used to see, real intellectual stuff. Now, everybody knows Sarasota is dependent on tourism, and so is Bradenton. On my way here today from Sarasota, I saw an unusual sight, which was a car with a Sarasota tag on it. So anyway, this is Sarasota the day before tourist season. And this is the same sign the day after tourist season. You know, they don't care. They put their blinker on when they leave Chicago, and they don't take it back off again until they get home. Honest to God, I followed a car down 41. Naturally, he was in the fast lane, going 27 miles an hour with his left-hand blinker on. And for no apparent reason, he made a hard right-hand turn in front of me, I guess just to do it. Maybe just to make me angry, which he did. Now, we talked about mosquitoes earlier. And when I was a kid, you couldn't go out of your house in the summertime. I'm sure many of you will remember this, without getting set upon by mosquitoes. So they put a gentleman named Williams in charge of mosquito control. And his solution to the problem, he had these mosquito foggers that were spewing out this DDT. And they would go up and down your neighborhood. And if you were at the trail drive-in trying to make out, they'd also be going up and down the trail drive-in. So when they came into the neighborhood, kids would go like ice cream truck, go follow the mosquito fogger. And when they came to our neighborhood, I'd say, "Hey, Mom, can I go run behind the mosquito fogger?" She'd say, "Sure, honey, just take your little sister." Now, this is John Ringling, of course. He's the reason that the area has become known as the Gulf Coast Cultural Hub. And he didn't come to Sarasota to get involved in real estate or development. He wanted to come here for rest and relaxation. Evidently, he and Mabel went to Tarpon Springs first, but they weren't warmly received, so he was convinced to come to Sarasota, where they did receive him well here. And this is Cottazon. Now, this was designed by a gentleman named Dwight James Baum, and it was built by Owen Burns Construction Company. And that island there, Mabel loved everything Venetian, and she had a gondola dock there. And when the hurricane of '26 came through, it took that island away and her gondola with it. Now, this is Sarasota Sheriff's Office. They just had a raid on a liquor still, and that's the still on top of the car there. And the gentleman on the right, that's Deputy Dean. Doesn't he look like one tough hombre? Anyways, he was the first one to use a surveillance aircraft to find out where people were putting their stills. Now, I came across this at the History Center. Bring back beer and unemployment. But I think what he was trying to convey was bring back beer and employment, but he was drunk when he wrote the sign. Now, this is Sarasota's finest, probably the late 40s and early 50s. This was taken on State Street. And this is before exercise became all the craze. There wasn't a set of Adidas on the whole force. Now, this was during Prohibition. Doesn't that kid look stewed? I mean, that was to make home beer with, I guess. And I guess that was some kind of an inducement to buy their product, but God. When I was a kid, the big thing to do, you got a six-pack of beer and went to the trail drive-in. And this is Owen Burns on the left and Dwight James Baum on the right there. And Baum did a lot of work in Sarasota, and so did Owen Burns. But Baum designed the Sarasota Courthouse and the El Vernona Hotel and Ringling's home at Cottazon and a number of other places. This is the old El Vernona that became the John Ringling Hotel and then the John Ringling Towers. And it's on 41 where the Ritz-Carlton is today. And this is this building's still there. This is at Little Five Points. And you can't get drugs there anymore, but if you drive about 2 miles down the street, you can get all the drugs you want, and you don't even need a prescription. Come right to your window. Now, so much is Eleanor Roosevelt used to come to Sarasota a lot, and her uncle lived on Siesta Key, David Gray. And she always remarked about the man-made land. And so much of Sarasota has been dredged and filled. Lido, for instance, that's a lot of dredge and fill. Where Van Wezel is, a lot of dredge and fill. And this is Owen Burns' dredge, the mud hen, he called it. In those days, if you wanted to dredge something, all you needed was a note from your mother, and you could basically dredge anything you wanted. And this is after he dredged up Golden Gate Point there. That was the starting point for the original John Ringling Bridge. And this is St. Armand's, which was, a series of little islets and rough islands that he joined, Burns and he joined together to make St. Armand's Circle there. Now this group, if you read the 1920s papers, this is the Czechoslovakian National Band, and they played a big role in Sarasota's social history. Ringling brought them to town when he opened up Ringling Isles and opened up the first Ringling Bridge. And they were from Czechoslovakia, naturally, but they got caught on Ellis Island, and they couldn't get a sponsor. I guess they didn't want them running all over the country. But Ringling agreed to sponsor them, and he brought them to Sarasota, and then he would loan them out to different grand openings, or they would march in their uniforms down Main Street. And they were great musicians, and they had a band shell made for them at Miramar Park in front of the hotel there. So anyways, when they opened up Payne Park, they were there. When they opened up the old Edwards Theater, they were there. If you made an addition to your house, they could be there playing in your front yard when you were finished with it. Now this is the first Ringling Bridge. And Sarasota and Bradenton both used to be fishing capitals in those days. And it was not unusual for shop owners to close their doors and go down to the bridge at noon on Wednesday and fish. But the problem became, do you see those high tension wires going across? Somebody would reel back with a steel leader and get caught in that tension line there, and they'd have a come to Jesus moment right there on the bridge. I mean, it was like an epiphany. So they passed an ordinance that limited the size of the leader. And then the other problem they would have, they might go back to cast and hook a 39 Buick. And this is what you could catch out of there. It was amazing. For the tarpon tournament, they gave a free car away, Packard or a Cadillac or something. And this is what you get out of there today. It's all gone. Now this is what ended the great land boom, the hurricane of September of '26 that tore through Miami with such devastation. So it was slowing down at the time, but this put the final nail in the coffin. So this might be a good place to stop. If you have any questions that you want to ask me, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Any questions? Well, then I'll say thank you. Oh, yes.
Who did you say dredged up Golden Gate and
Owen Burns.
Owen Burns?
See, Owen Burns and John Ringling worked a lot together. Because Ringling was away with the circus. And Burns had come to town right after Bertha Palmer, and for $35,000, he owned 75% of the city limits of Sarasota. So he bought that from Gillespie and became Sarasota's first major developer. And then he and Ringling had a falling out, and then Ringling acquired Burns Hotel, the Venona. So it was kind of ugly at the end. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
We always hear the myth here that we're protected by the Indians, so there are no hurricanes that come to
Yeah.
Sarasota and Bradenton.
Right.
But what about that?
No, it is a myth. No, the way that story got started, they used to have a pageant called the Serra DeSoto pageant, and it was written about 1900-something by J.D. Chapline, and it told the story of Serra DeSoto, who was Hernando DeSoto's daughter, whom he supposedly brought over here when he came to slay the Indians on his way to wherever he ended up. Well, in the first place, he never had a daughter. And as Chapline writes the story, he got sick. Chi-Chi got sick. And Serra ministered to him and brought him back to health. Well, then she got sick. And Chi-Chi couldn't do anything to help her, and she died. So Hernando, being the liberal that he was, said to Chi-Chi, you can bury her in Sarasota Bay. So Chi-Chi and this band of 100 Indians took her out in a canoe, chopped holes in the canoes, sank. So the story is the white caps are Chi-Chi's braves guarding the body of Serra. So that's the story. Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about Colonel Gillespie, our first bar president, and the contributions he made to Sarasota and to Manatee County.
Well, you know, it's amazing. What's amazing about those guys is, like, not only Gillespie but Burns and Ringling, they had no development experience whatsoever. But his father sent him over. I think he was living in Australia at the time, and as you saw, he was a young man when he got here. And he just put into place the infrastructure, you know, the hotels, beautified the downtown as best he could, and he also started the Church of the Redeemer, and he was a deacon in the Church of the Redeemer for a number of years. But he became known around the state of Florida as the golfing mayor. And he would go to, he saw the wisdom of golf to attract people, to attract tourism. So he would go around the state and preach the wisdom of having golf. And he worked for the Plant organization, and he put hotels in different, not hotels, put different golf courses in different parts of Florida and in Cuba. And I think that sums him up. I mean, he was very well thought of in the community. Sure. And Gillespie, excuse me, Browning tells a story of him taking practice swings. And Gillespie asked Browning, do you play golf? And Browning said, no, I don't play. And he said, Mon, you're missing half your life. So if there are no more questions, I'll just say thank you for having me. And I hope you have a good afternoon.
Well, that was interesting. That was very, very fascinating. Thank you, Mr. LaHurd, for joining us today and telling us so much about everything. Thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you, sir.